So in this video I'll be going over rendering. Basically rendering is the process of taking your CAD model and creating a image of the model, and that's useful for sharing it with people, right? Like, this is what I'm working on, stuff like that. You can always take a screenshot, but screenshots aren't very high quality and it doesn't look realistic, for example. And one of the uses for renderings is when you're doing a technical binder, right? You can always take an actual picture of your robot, but you have to set up the robot, you have to set up the lighting, and that takes a lot of work and time. And so what you can do is you can just take renders of your CAD model and make it look realistic so that you have really nice pictures that correspond with your mechanisms, but you don't actually need to set all that up in real life. So the first process, there's multiple ways to render in Inventor. Some take less time and yield less quality results. Some take more time and yield higher quality results. But there's some basic things you can do to make things look more realistic. So the first thing is, if you go in the View tab, there's this Visual Style tab, and you have all these options. I generally like using realistic, but even if I'm CADing something, not necessarily rendering, but there's all these other options that you might want to use when you're CADing. For example, like technical illustration, it makes everything very clear, right? But this definitely does not look realistic. So you're gonna make sure if you're in a different mode, you're in realistic, right? The next thing is in shadows. You can turn shadows off when you're CADing something because it takes computational power to calculate shadows, and that slows everything down. But I generally leave object and ambient on, and then for renders, I also turn on ground shadows because it creates like a shadow if this was placed on ground or something, right? And it adds more to the picture. Now, in terms of how Inventor determines where the ground is, basically in this view cube here, whatever is the bottom face, that's what it considers ground. So if I were to go on the top face and say right click, set current view as front, now it changes where the ground is. So let me find where it says the bottom is, right? So now the bottom has become that's where the shadow is. But I don't want to take a picture of my gearbox like facing the ground like that. So we want to make this the front again. So right click, set current view as front, and our shadow is back in the correct place if I were to take a picture like this. Next thing is reflections. So you can turn on reflections. Again, this is one of those things where if you're doing this while you're CADing, reflections are going to slow down your computer, but when you're rendering, you want it to look realistic. So this may not be realistic in all cases, but I just think reflections make your renders look a little bit better. The biggest thing you can change from like a CAD screenshot is changing your view to perspective. So orthographic, right? What orthographic means, if you don't know, or if you haven't taken art or anything, is that like if I have this motor and it's like 7 inches long, it looks to me like it's 7 inches long and it's going straight ahead. But if you ever go on like a long highway or something, or if you look down a long hallway, you'll see it almost looks like the walls of the road sort of converge to one point, because that's how our eyes see everything. That's how we perceive distance. And so if you switch to perspective, it creates a subtle difference, but you'll see it looks a lot more like I was sitting in front of this gearbox and looking at it. A better example would be, for example, a drivetrain. Let me pull one up. Let's see. Let's do that. And there is. It's opening. There's the tour, right? So if you go in view here, and so right now this looks alright, but when I change it to perspective, right, all of a sudden it looks like it was actually right there and I was looking at it from like bird's eye view, or like just standing in front of it. So that's when you want to use perspective. Right, so we have perspective here. The next thing is the lighting. So Inventor has lots of lighting options, and that basically determines like how bright and how many reflections you get, stuff like that. So the default setting it's okay, but I personally prefer like the photo booth one, for example. It it creates a better view in my opinion. Again, this is like a very subjective thing based on what you like, what you don't like. Another like common one that you can use is grid light. and it takes a while to load because it's sort of calculating how bright everything should be, stuff like that. And there's also other options here. For example, like if I did, where is it? If I did a Stuttgart courtyard, right? So instead of just doing the lighting, it actually puts like a background image on. So this is like some random courtyard, and it looks like the gearbox is there. So this doesn't look all that interesting or realistic, but in some cases, like if there was a drivetrain on this, it might look like, oh, it's somewhere in real life. So you can do that, but I generally stick with either doing photo booth, plain room, default. But you can play around with these all you want. And then, all right, so we're back to this, and then this is Inventor in dark mode, so that's what the background looks like. But I prefer for rendering to changing it, so options, colors, and I generally like doing winter day. It has this like grayish color. You can also do presentation with a single color, and that has like a white background, so this doesn't look all that bad either. But I prefer the winter day with a gradient on it. You can also do background images, but I prefer not to. And then yeah, so there's my gearbox. There's a reflection. You can change the view you want. Right, and then something like this maybe. There's a bit of a reflection there. Now from here, right, so that was very quick. That was, barely any time spent on making this render, or making this image at least. And now you can do multiple things. So the fastest thing you can do is take a screenshot, or you can go on File, Export, Image, and you can export as like a PNG. So you can go down here, select PNG or a JPEG, depending on whatever you want. And then let's just do export PNG, right? And then in options, what you can do is you can set a resolution, right? So if I want like a 1080p resolution, right? You can search these numbers up on Google. Like what is a HD resolution like? What is a 4K resolution like? And you can do a transparent background. So if you're inserting this into like presentations, like Google Slides or something, and you have a purple background, you don't want the gray background in here, you can just do transparent, hit OK, and it will save this image. And then if I were to open up this export, right, it looks alright. If I share this with someone, it would look okay, but it sort of falls apart when you zoom in, because you can see it gets a little bit blurry, the details aren't all that great. And then we'll spend some more time comparing like what the multiple options do. Another way of rendering is something called ray tracing. So basically right now the shadows and reflections, they are kind of fake, as in Inventor doesn't really know what they would actually be like. It just sort of estimates based on where the motor is, where the plates are. But what ray tracing does is it basically simulates the rays of light hitting your object, whatever is in your view, and bouncing off of it and going wherever they want, right? And so that's something ray tracing would do, and sort of figure out, okay, where should the shadow really go? Where should the reflections really be? And what it also does is, like, for example, if this bearing and this washer are shiny, right? They should reflect this gear here as well, but clearly there's no reflection of the gear here. Ray tracing will pick that up. It'll bounce off the gear and see, oh, it reflects onto the washer, right? So small details, you can argue it's not necessary, but you can turn ray tracing on. And then ray tracing does take some time, and there's 3 settings for ray tracing, so once it pops up, we'll be able to see it. So there's low, draft, and high. So low is, it's low mode, it's very quick, right? So you can see it's already moving super fast, and it'll create a low quality ray trace. You can see the image sort of sharpens up as it goes. There's draft, which is like a mediocre mode. And then there's high, which is, it takes a while, like it'll take a long time to finish, to get to this like blue fine. Progress with the fine basically means it's like really good, it's good to go. It takes a while to get there, but it will look really good, right? So ray tracing is one way. And then the final way you can render is going into environments. So this is like, so in terms of like a spectrum, right? Exporting is very quick, but very low quality. Ray tracing is like the middle ground where you can choose to do a low mode and do it fairly fast, but also have decent quality. You can go high and have a really high quality, but it takes a while. And then this final Inventor Studio, like going to environments, Inventor Studio, this is the version that takes the most computational time. Like it takes a toll on your CPU and if you have a GPU, but it does result in the best results. And so what you do is you click on render image, and here you can change lighting even more. So like if you think this looks really dark, for example, you can add more lights somewhere. So you can do, there's a light, you can start placing the light somewhere like on the gear, like that's where it will point to. Yeah, and you can see like it brightens up the gear, for example. So you can set all those things up, and then you can create and you can hit render image, and then here you can specify like the resolution. So I can do like 1920 by 1080. You can change the lighting and view if you want to. The output is like the file name. You can set that right now or later. Render, so this is where you can set like the quality basically. This is the accuracy you want, right? This determines how fast or slow it goes. And then by iteration, so there's multiple settings. So do you want to render for a certain amount of time? Like if you only have half an hour to render, then you set this to 30 minutes, and whatever quality it gets to in 30 minutes will be it. You can do by iteration. So what it does, it basically passes over the image multiple times, and you can set how many times it passes over. So 32 is like a default. You can bump it up a little bit to 48, 64 to get some higher quality. You can bump it down if you just want something quicker. And then there's until satisfactory, which is just it's gonna just keep rendering, and then whenever you look at your computer and you think this looks like a good render, you could stop there. So I'm gonna do until satisfactory for now, and then hit render, and it'll create this window, and it'll like start rendering. You can see the image starts out blurry, and then it's gonna try to sharpen it up. These are all the passes that it's doing, and here like you can pause it, basically pause the render. You can save the file, so this is where if you click save, you can save the file name, and like so you would basically continue rendering, right? You keep doing this, and now you think, oh, the image looks kind of good, so that you pause it, you save it, stuff like that. So that's how Inventor Studio works. I'm gonna finish that, and then now I'm gonna just show you guys some examples of renders. So I did these ahead of time because renders take a while. So this is let's go back to exporting. So I don't want to zoom in. This is exporting in 4K resolution. So this is the export option, right? So without zooming in, it looks great, right? It looks like a solid render. Start zooming in, you see all these like black parts of it. That's an attempt at shadows, but again, they're fake shadows, so they're not actually great, right? So it looks okay, but I wouldn't really like it. This is a low ray trace, and you can see it took like 38 seconds to do this, but all of a sudden, right, because we're ray tracing, those shadows become a lot better. They're not the best, but they're not bad either, right? They don't look like random attempts at making a shadow. And if you like pay attention on this brass portion here, you can like see the teeth of that gear, right? Whereas if you go back to our exported image, if you zoom in on this portion here, you see nothing because it can't figure that out on its own. This is a draft setting ray trace, so this took 402 seconds, right? So it takes a little bit more time. The shadows are more refined, right? Everything's just a little bit more refined in this one. And then we have a high ray trace, so this took the most time, 3,500 seconds. But you can like zoom in, and it looks, the shadows and lighting is very accurate, but it's a little bit blurry as well. This is the Inventor Studio, so this took 510 seconds because it was only HD and I didn't want to spend too much time. But this is comparable to the high ray trace version. If I spent more time on this, and I bumped up the quality to 4K, it would look a lot better. And then this is a transparent image export, so it's like the same thing, it's just there's a transparent background. And then this is the HD resolution export, and if you pick out the details, it's a little bit worse than the 4K export, but not better than the ray traced ones. So that's an example of basically how these different versions look. And so obviously the more time you spend on the renders, the better they'll come out, but you don't always have to spend that much time. In terms of what's really like the highest quality you can go for, so there's this application by Autodesk called VRED, VRED. It stands for Virtual Reality Editor, I think. And that has a much better rendering option than Inventor, because Inventor is a CAD program and then it has rendering on it, but VRED is like specifically for visual stuff. And so let me find an example. So if you go here into this Cadathon, this is where I use VRED for some of the renders. So for example, this render here, like it looks a lot better, and then the quality is a lot higher too, right? Like I can zoom in that much and it still looks pretty crystal clear. And then some details, you can see lots of details, right? Like the pink of the belts is reflected in the black paint there. Let's see, what else do we have? There's a drivetrain render. You can see reflections of different things. So the pink of the bumpers is reflected in the motor case here, right? And then you can see reflections on the gussets as well. So this is where like red is much better and faster than Inventor, but I won't go into red in this video. This is just for quick Inventor renders that look pretty good.